Under the gleaming glass towers of San Francisco, Nathaniel Hayes sat in silence at the edge of a boardroom table longer than most people's apartments. The hum of the city below barely reached the 72nd floor of the Hayes Technologies headquarters, a sanctuary built on decades of precision, power, and relentless ambition. His tailored charcoal suit hugged his form as neatly as the life he had carved for himself, disciplined, orderly, and untouched by emotion. At 51, Nathaniel had built a tech empire, acquired enough wealth to last several lifetimes, and earned the reverence and fear of his peers. Yet, he sat alone, holding a glass of untouched scotch and staring at an empty space across the table. For a man who had conquered everything measurable, profits, patents, market share, he found himself haunted by something immeasurable. Legacy. Not the kind written in Forbes, but the kind that bore his blood. He wanted an heir, someone who would carry his name not just as a line on a birth certificate, but as a future. He had no illusions about fatherhood being sentimental. He didn't crave bedtime stories or hand-drawn cards. What he craved was continuity. A child raised with structure, excellence, and the Hayes name, not polluted by emotion or the instability of modern relationships. Love to Nathaniel had always been a myth, an elaborate illusion designed to distract men from their goals. He had tried it more than once, only to find himself drained, manipulated, or betrayed. Women either wanted to change him or mold themselves into something temporary, ultimately resenting the cost of proximity to his world. So he stopped trying. If he wanted an heir, he would have to acquire one the way he did everything else, through a deal, clear terms, and no room for chaos. His legal team had already drawn up the contract. The woman would be compensated generously. She would receive full medical care, a private residence, and $600,000 at the end of her pregnancy. In return, she would relinquish all parental rights. No lingering emotional ties, no visitation, no blurred boundaries. All that remained was finding the woman. That afternoon, Nathaniel stepped into his car, not knowing that the answer to his calculated dilemma would appear not in an elite agency portfolio or a recommendation from a discreet intermediary, but on the city's most iconic bridge. As his black sedan rolled slowly across the Golden Gate Bridge, his mind churned through options, professional surrogates, foreign arrangements, private clinics, none of which felt quite right. He didn't want a vessel. He wanted someone strong enough to bear his child but desperate enough to accept his terms. Someone who could disappear afterward, leaving behind no complication. Then he saw her. She was weaving between cars, a tray of candy in her arms, offering them to indifferent drivers. Her clothes were faded, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. But her presence struck him, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she moved with purpose, determined, unapologetic. Most people would avert their eyes, embarrassed to be seen in such a vulnerable position. But she didn't shrink. She met rejection with calm persistence and dignity. Her name, he would learn later, was Eva Morales. Nathaniel watched as she approached a beat-up hatchback, her smile weary but polite. The driver shook his head. She nodded and moved on. Her strength unsettled him, not in a threatening way, but in a way that made him question the neat logic of his plan. He drove past her, then stopped at the next red light. Her image wouldn't leave his mind. Before he knew it, he was circling back. He found her again halfway down the bridge, pausing to shift the weight of her candy tray. He rolled down the window. "Excuse me," he called out. She glanced over, cautious. "Yes?" she asked, her voice low, guarded. "Are you single?" Her eyes narrowed, and for a second, he saw fire behind the fatigue. "Is that seriously your opening line?" she shot back. Nathaniel, unshaken, replied calmly. "I have a proposition. Not romantic. Business." She eyed him skeptically, lips pressed into a thin line. "Business? You think I'm stupid?" "No," he said. "I think you're smart enough to recognize an opportunity." There was silence. Then she gave a short, bitter laugh. "There's always a catch." "There's always a choice," he corrected. He handed her a card. "If you're interested in hearing more, meet me at the cafe on Polk Street tomorrow at 10. Eva took the card without a word. He drove off, unsure why he even bothered making the offer in person. He wasn't a man who recruited on impulse, but something about her, her resilience, her dignity, felt right. That night, Eva sat on the floor of her cramped apartment in the Mission District. Her grandmother, Catalina, was asleep on the sofa, her shallow breaths punctuated by occasional coughing. The smell of menthol and old wool filled the air. Bills were scattered on the floor. Overdue notices, medical estimates, eviction warnings. The city outside buzzed with life she couldn't afford to join. She held Nathaniel's card like a cursed talisman. Nathaniel Hayes, it read, along with a private number and no title. She had heard the name before. His company's logo was on tech towers all over the city. She had never imagined him to be real. Eva had always prided herself on surviving without handouts. Her parents had died young. Catalina raised her with tough love and hard lessons. She knew how to stretch $5 for a week. But now, with Catalina's condition worsening and no savings left, her pride had become a burden she might no longer afford. At 10 a.m. sharp, she walked into the cafe, not dressed to impress but clean and steady. Nathaniel was already there, a folder on the table, coffee untouched. "Glad you came," he said, gesturing to the seat. "I haven't agreed to anything," she replied, sitting down. "Understood." He opened the folder. "I want you to carry on, my child. You'll be compensated with $600,000. You'll live in a safe private residence with full access to medical care. After the birth, you'll have no further obligation. All legal rights will belong to me." Eva stared at him silent then. "Why me?" "Because you're strong, practical, and because I don't want complications. You strike me as someone who understands survival." Her hands trembled slightly under the table, but she kept her voice calm. "And what if I say no? Then I'll thank you for your time and wish you well." She left without giving an answer. But later that night, when Catalina collapsed in the kitchen and Eva sat by her side listening to shallow, gasping breaths, the weight of decision shifted, not toward desperation, but resolve. By morning, she had made the call. "This is Eva Morales," she said. "I want to discuss the details." And so the deal began. A business transaction on paper, sealed not with affection, but with necessity. Neither of them knew that what they were truly signing was the first page of a story that would change everything. Eva stood at the gates of the Hayes estate, her worn sneakers sinking slightly into the gravel of the pristine driveway. The towering wrought iron gate, flanked by stone pillars entwined with ivy, opened with a slow, deliberate creak as the security system recognized her arrival. The world beyond that threshold was unlike anything she had known. A sprawling vineyard in Napa Valley bathed in soft morning light. The mansion perched in the distance like something out of a forgotten painting. She clutched her single duffel, bagged tightly, the same one she'd used since high school, and stepped inside. Every part of her body wanted to turn around, to retreat back into the uncomfortable familiarity of her old life. But she couldn't. Not when Catalina now rested in a private clinic, receiving the care she had long been denied. Not when the A contract had been signed, sealed, and backed by the most powerful name in Silicon Valley. The drive up the long tree-lined path gave her time to take in the place. The vineyards rolled like waves, green and infinite. Olive trees dotted the landscape, and flower beds near the entrance were trimmed with painful precision. The house itself was massive but strangely quiet, almost like it had never truly been lived in. Stephanie greeted her at the front door. Tall, poised, and impeccably dressed, she looked like she belonged to the pages of a luxury magazine. "Ms. Morales," she said warmly. "Welcome to the Hayes residence. I'll give you a tour and show you to your quarters. Mr. Hayes will meet you later this afternoon." Eva followed her in, her eyes adjusting to the hushed interior. The walls were lined with minimalist art and expensive furniture that seemed untouched. The whole place had the feel of a luxury hotel, perfect, curated, but devoid of soul. "You'll have full access to the East Wing," Stephanie explained, leading her past a library, a music room, and a sunroom that overlooked the garden. "There's a kitchen staff, but if you'd like to cook yourself, you're welcome to use the private kitchen connected to your suite. You'll meet with Dr. Lagrange tomorrow to begin the next round of fertility assessments. Is there anything you need?" Eva shook her head, overwhelmed. "No, I'm okay." The guest wing was larger than any apartment she had ever lived in. A king-size bed with ivory sheets, a fireplace, floor-to-ceiling windows, a private bath with a soaking tub, and a walk-in closet that echoed when she stepped inside. It felt surreal, like she had stepped onto the set of someone else's life. That night she stood barefoot on the balcony, watching the horizon bleed into dusk. The air smelled of grapes and distant rain. Her mind wandered to Catalina, safe, medicated, warm for the first time in months. That alone made this sacrifice worth it. But still, a hollow pit rested in her stomach. She wasn't just here to live in luxury. She was here to conceive and carry a child for a man she barely knew, a man who had all the warmth of steel and glass. It was hard to forget the way Nathaniel had looked at her during their last meeting. Not cruel, not even unkind, just clinical, as if she were part of an equation he was solving. The next morning came early. Stephanie woke her with a gentle knock and a tailored itinerary. Breakfast, medical screening, psychological evaluation, nutritional consult. Everything was arranged, sterile and efficient. Nathaniel didn't appear until late afternoon. Eva was in the garden, kneeling in the dirt with a small hand shovel. She had found an abandoned patch near the eastern wall, dry soil, overgrown, with weeds clearly untouched for seasons. She wasn't a gardener, not really, but digging gave her something to do, something to claim. He didn't speak at first. She noticed him standing at a distance, arms crossed, watching her. His suit looked out of place amid the vines and soil. "You're not obligated to do manual labor," he finally said. "I'm not doing it for you," Eva replied without turning around. "This is for me." He walked closer, his shoes crunching, softly against the gravel path. Most people would be enjoying the amenities. Pool, wine cellar, 1,000 other luxuries. Most people haven't lived in survival mode for most of their lives, she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "This keeps me sane." Nathaniel studied her in silence, then nodded slightly and turned back toward the house. The interaction was brief, but it left something hanging in the air. An unspoken acknowledgement of difference, perhaps even respect. Days turned into weeks. The fertility treatments began. Hormone injections, blood work, ultrasounds. It was grueling, more invasive than Eva had expected. Her body felt foreign, like a machine being recalibrated by strangers. But she endured it with the same quiet resilience that had carried her through years of hardship. Nathaniel kept his distance, as promised. He never pried, never invaded, but he watched, always. Eva would catch glimpses of him during her sessions, reviewing reports, speaking with doctors, checking data points. He approached parenthood like a business acquisition, every risk managed, every outcome forecasted, but cracks in his armor began to show. One night, Eva found him in the library, not working but reading, an old novel, its pages yellowed and fragile. She paused in the doorway, surprised. "I didn't think you read fiction," she said. He looked up, startled but not irritated. "Sometimes, stories have structure, beginnings, middles, endings. There's comfort in that." "You like control," she observed. "I like certainty," he corrected. "Life doesn't give you that, especially not with a child." He didn't respond immediately. Then he closed the book gently. "That's why I tried to design a process, a way to eliminate the chaos." "You can't eliminate chaos," Eva said quietly. "You can only live through it." He looked at her then, really looked, and for a moment she saw something flicker in his eyes. Doubt, perhaps. Or longing. "I was raised by someone who hated uncertainty," he said finally. "My father believed that emotion was weakness, that to be in control meant being alone." "That's not strength," Eva replied. "That's fear wearing a suit." The conversation ended there, but the weight of it lingered. When the day came for the embryo transfer, Eva sat on the clinic bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling both detached and deeply shaken. Nathaniel was outside, reviewing legal documents with a specialist. The procedure took minutes, but afterward, lying there, Eva felt something shift inside her. Not physically, but emotionally. She had entered this deal thinking of survival. Now, something more delicate was emerging. Possibility. Maybe even hope. Back at the estate, Nathaniel didn't speak of the procedure, but he asked Stephanie to have a rocking chair delivered to Eva's room. And when the first set of pregnancy tests came back positive, he didn't celebrate, but he didn't retreat either. He stood in the doorway of her room as she read the results, his hands buried in his pockets. "It's happening," she said, her voice a mix of awe and uncertainty. He nodded, eyes steady. "Yes, it is." She didn't know then how those words would become a refrain between them in the months to come, but for now it was enough. The contract had brought them together. But life, messy, unpredictable, full of soil and stories, was beginning to grow something neither of them had planned. The days following the embryo transfer unfolded in measured rhythms, like the slow unfurling of a long-forgotten symphony. The Hayes estate remained as pristine and perfectly managed as ever, but Eva's perception of it was beginning to shift. What once felt sterile now held small echoes of life, her life. The early mornings, the scent of chamomile from her tea, The soft rustle of sheets when she couldn't sleep all signaled a change, subtle but unmistakable. The staff was discreet, professional, but increasingly attentive to her comfort. Stephanie ensured her favorite fruits were stocked without Eva asking, and even the cold-faced head chef began offering her choices instead of set menus. The estate was learning her. The first positive confirmation of her pregnancy came in the form of a faint blue line on a white stick. Eva stared at it for minutes. Her breath caught somewhere between joy and dread. This wasn't just theory anymore. There was life growing inside her, a reality more profound than she had expected. She touched her belly with uncertain fingers, not quite ready to accept the responsibility and gravity of what had begun. Nathaniel didn't show an obvious reaction to the news, but something in the way he moved shifted. He walked a little slower, listened more closely, and his gaze lingered longer when he looked at her. One afternoon, while they sat across from each other in the sunroom reviewing her updated medical plan, he said quietly, "Thank you for taking this seriously." Eva glanced up surprised. "You thought I wouldn't?" "I wasn't sure," he admitted. "I thought perhaps you might treat this as a transaction." "It started that way," she said honestly, "but it doesn't feel that way anymore." He nodded, accepting the truth in her words, though his expression remained unreadable. As her body adjusted to pregnancy, so too did her emotions. There were mornings when nausea overtook her before she could rise, and nights when her back ached from a weight that hadn't fully developed yet. But it wasn't the physical changes that unsettled her most, it was the emotional ones. The quiet moments when she found herself daydreaming about the baby, wondering what kind of person they would become, what pieces of her, what echoes of Nathaniel might live in that tiny heartbeat. It was during her second ultrasound that everything changed. Nathaniel insisted on attending, though he stood stiffly by the wall of the private clinic room, arms folded like a man bracing for bad news. Eva lay back, heart pounding as the cool gel touched her skin. The doctor adjusted the screen, and within seconds a flutter appeared, a tiny flicker pulsing rhythmically. "There's the heartbeat," the doctor said with a smile. "Strong, steady, beautiful." The room went silent, save for that sound. Eva's eyes filled with tears, catching her off guard. She didn't cry easily, but this wasn't sadness. It was awe, pure and untamed. When she turned her head, she caught Nathaniel staring at the screen, not with analysis or calculation, but wonder. His face was softer than she had ever seen it, as if the cold armor he wore daily had cracked under the sound of something real, something uncontrollable. He didn't speak on the ride home, neither did she, but the silence wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken meaning. That evening, as Eva walked through the vineyard alone, letting the early spring breeze kiss her skin, she noticed Nathaniel sitting on a bench near the rose garden. He held a folder in his lap but wasn't reading. His eyes were distant, locked on the horizon. She approached without hesitation. "Mind if I sit?" He nodded, moving the folder to the side. They sat together in the quiet, the fading light casting golden shadows on the path. "You looked surprised today," she said. "I was," he admitted. "Why?" "I didn't think I'd feel anything," he said honestly. "I designed this to be efficient, controlled, but hearing the heartbeat, it made it real, in a way I wasn't prepared for." Eva studied him. "You've spent your life avoiding the unpredictable." "Yes," he said. "Because unpredictability is dangerous." "Not always," she replied. "Sometimes it's the only way to grow." He looked at her then, truly looked. "You're not what I expected, Eva. I know, you wanted someone who would disappear." There was a pause. "I wanted someone who wouldn't make me feel," he said. They sat in silence again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was thick with truth. From that day on, something shifted between them. Nathaniel began joining her during doctor's visits, not just as a silent observer, but as a participant. He asked questions. He researched symptoms. He ordered new equipment for her comfort before she even voiced a need. He also became more present outside of appointments. He joined her on walks, watched her tend the garden, even asked about her childhood. Eva shared stories hesitantly at first, of long bus rides to underpaid jobs, of Catalina's relentless will, of the moments she almost gave up. She expected judgment or pity. She got neither, only listening, pure unfiltered listening. One night, as they stood in the kitchen, Ever craving something sweet and strange, Nathaniel surprised her by attempting to bake. It was a disaster. He followed the recipe to the letter, but his hands lacked the instincts of someone who had ever needed to cook. The cookies came out lopsided, overly crisp on the edges and gooey in the middle. Eva laughed so hard she cried. And for the first time, Nathaniel laughed too. A genuine startled sound like he hadn't done it in years. "You're terrible at this," she said, wiping her eyes. "I'm excellent at most things," he said, mock offended. "But not this." "No," he admitted. "Not this." It became their thing. Imperfect baking sessions where the rules didn't matter. Where flour dusted expensive countertops and laughter echoed through halls once filled only with silence. Still, there were boundaries. Nathaniel was not a man who embraced vulnerability easily. His moments of softness were brief, often followed by withdrawal. He would retreat into work, into strategy, into control. But Eva saw him trying, and trying to her meant everything. They never spoke of what would happen after the birth. The contract was still intact, the terms still firm, but neither of them brought it up anymore. One morning, Nathaniel found Eva asleep in the garden chair, hand resting on her growing belly, face tilted toward the sun. She looked peaceful in a way that made his chest ache. He crouched beside her and whispered, "You're already a good mother." She didn't wake, but she smiled in her sleep. It was then he realized the terrifying truth. He didn't just want a child. He wanted her, not as part of a deal, not as an accessory to his legacy, but as the center of something real, something unpredictable, something worth risking everything for, and he had no idea what to do about it. Spring deepened in the Napa Valley, and with it, a quiet transformation began to settle over the Hayes estate. Eva's pregnancy moved steadily into its second trimester, and her body, once lean and tense with years of hardship, had softened into a visible arc of life. She moved with more care now, her steps slower, but her spirit remained unyielded. Her presence had taken root in the house, not as a guest, not even as an employee of Nathaniel's unusual arrangement, but as something harder to define, something organic and real. The changes were subtle at first. Fresh flowers began appearing in her suite, arrangements that matched her mood more often than not. A small kitchen garden was added near her bedroom balcony, seeded with mint, rosemary, and the tomatoes she had casually mentioned once missing from her childhood yard. The estate began to respond to her presence, just as Nathaniel did. They had reached an unspoken rhythm in their daily interactions. Eva no longer flinched at Nathaniel's bluntness. He no longer braced for her candor. Their conversations moved from transactional to reflective, often spilling into long moments of silence that felt full rather than empty. One evening, while they sat on the veranda watching the sun sink behind the vines, Nathaniel handed Eva a soft leather-bound journal. "I had it made," he said, not meeting her eyes, "in case you wanted to write something for the baby, or for yourself." Eva held the journal with surprise. It was heavy in her hands, the leather soft, the pages thick and cream-colored. She turned it over, then looked up at him. "Thank you," she said softly. "That's thoughtful." "I don't know if it's the right thing," he admitted, still not quite able to express what moved him to do it. "It doesn't have to be right. It just has to be real." Their shared moments like this one began to carve a path towards something deeper, something neither had anticipated. Yet both were wary of naming it. One morning, after a particularly intense night of dreams, Eva found herself in the main library, scanning the shelves for something to distract her. She pulled out a book on architecture, thumbing through sketches of old European cathedrals. Nathaniel walked in a few minutes later, freshly shaven and dressed in his usual precision. "I didn't know you were interested in design," he remarked, glancing at the book in her hands. "I'm not," she replied, flipping another page. "But I like the idea of building something meant to last." He nodded, then after a pause said, "Would you join me this weekend? There's a charity gala in San Francisco. It's formal, you'd need something suitable, but I think it might be good for you, for us." Eva blinked. "A charity gala? I host it every year. This time I'd like to go with you." She closed the book. "Not as a project?" His voice didn't falter. "As a partner." Those words stayed with her all week. Not in the romantic sense. He hadn't crossed that line. But in the quiet revolution of recognizing her as something more than a surrogate, as someone with value beyond her function. When the evening of the gala arrived, Ava stood before the full-length mirror in her suite, wearing a midnight blue gown tailored to hug her shape gently. Stephanie had helped her with her hair, sweeping it up with elegance that surprised even Ava herself. Her growing belly was visible but graceful, and for the first time in a long while, she saw herself not as someone surviving, but as a woman being seen. Nathaniel waited downstairs, his tuxedo immaculate, his expression unreadable until she descended the staircase. Then his eyes widened just slightly, his usual control giving way to something resembling awe. "You look radiant," he said, the words clumsy in his mouth. Eva smiled. "You clean up well yourself." The gala was held in a glass-domed atrium, overlooking the Bay Bridge. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above them, and champagne flowed like water. Nathaniel moved with the ease of someone used to being watched, admired, obeyed. But that night his attention rarely left Eva. She didn't miss how the others looked at her, curious, assessing, judging, but she held her head high. Let them wonder, she thought. Let them try to guess the story. Only she and Nathaniel knew the truth, and even that truth was evolving. During dinner, between clinking forks and murmured conversations, she leaned toward him. "You don't have to keep me glued to your side, you know. I can handle small talk." "No," he replied. "But I don't want to let you go." There was no flirtation in his voice, only sincerity. Eva didn't reply, but a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the wine. Later, when a string quartet began to play, he asked her to dance. She hesitated, unsure of her balance, her comfort, but then placed her hand in his. They swayed slowly, his hand careful at the small of her back, their steps quiet against the polished marble floor. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked, softly. "I needed to see you outside of the contract. Outside of the estate." "And what did you see?" He looked at her then, his voice quieter than the music. "I saw someone I didn't want to lose." When they returned to the estate that night, neither said much. But as Ava closed her bedroom door behind her, her heartbeat raced, not from nerves but from a sense that something irreversible had shifted. The next day, Nathaniel joined her. During her afternoon walk through the garden. "There's something I want to show you," he said. She followed him through a small gate she hadn't noticed before. Beyond it was a separate structure, older than the rest of the estate, with ivy climbing up its stone walls. Inside, the air was cooler, scented with wood and paper. It was a private studio, part office, part memory. Books lined the shelves, and on the desk sat framed photographs. Eva picked one up. A woman, young, dark-haired, smiling beside a boy who looked strikingly like a younger Nathaniel. "My mother," he said behind her. "She died when I was 15. She was the only softness I ever knew." Eva placed the photo down carefully. "You've never mentioned her. I don't talk about her often, or about anything that feels as vulnerable. You're doing it now." "I'm trying," he said. "You make me want to try." The honesty in his voice undid something in her. She turned to face him. "I don't know what this is becoming, Nathaniel, but I'm scared. Scared I'll lose myself. Scared you'll disappear into your rules again." He stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel his breath. "I'm scared too," he said, "but not of losing control. I'm scared of what happens if I don't try to be more than I was." They didn't kiss. They didn't even touch. But something deeper passed between them in that quiet, vulnerable moment. A recognition. A choice. From that night forward, they began moving through the estate, not as strangers bound by legal terms, but as people sharing. The fragile, tentative shape of something growing between them, around them, and within Ava's womb. Neither knew exactly what they were building, but both knew it was no longer just a contract. It was something entirely human, entirely alive. The following weeks wove themselves into a fragile rhythm, held together by more than just the rituals of appointments and test results. The estate, once a quiet fortress of solitude, now pulsed gently with something new. It was not joy exactly, not yet, but an awareness that something sacred was taking root. Ava's body had begun to change more rapidly. The swell of her belly was now undeniable, drawing glances even from the usually impassive estate staff. The medical team, always professional, now addressed her with softened tones as if the presence of new life demanded reverence. And though Eva kept her outward composure, the deeper layers of pregnancy had begun to stir things in her that she hadn't been prepared for. Her dreams changed. They became more vivid, more tender. Sometimes they were of her as a child, curled on Catalina's lap. Other times she dreamt of a small hand gripping her finger tightly, of laughter echoing through hallways, of a faceless child calling her mama. These dreams woke her in the early hours, heart pounding, and she would sit up, pressing a hand against her stomach, whispering promises to the life growing inside her. Nathaniel, too, was shifting. Though his days remained structured, meetings, reports, meticulous control, he made space for Eva in ways neither of them spoke aloud. He began joining her in her daily walks through the vineyard. At first it was quiet companionship, his steps a steady rhythm beside hers. But over time the silence softened into conversation. They talked about things he never told anyone, about how he used to be afraid of the dark as a boy, how he'd hide under his sheets and wait for morning to make the world feel safe again. About the night his father told him emotions were liabilities, and the next day he stopped crying forever. He told her how it felt to build an empire, only to realize one day that it couldn't hold him when he was alone. And Eva in turn told him about Catalina's lullabies, sung in Spanish while boiling beans on the stove, about growing up with holes in her shoes but pride in her spine, about learning how to love without conditions because that was the only kind of love her grandmother could afford to give. These moments weren't explosive or dramatic. They were steady, like water wearing a waystone. One afternoon, as they sat in the shade of an old olive tree, Eva handed Nathaniel a page from the journal he had given her. It was a letter to the baby. He read it silently, eyes scanning her. Neat handwriting, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he handed it back without a word. But hours later, she found that same page carefully folded on his desk beside a printed photograph of an ultrasound. It was his way of saying he'd read it more than once. That weekend, Eva was surprised to find an entire room near the east wing, transformed. The once empty space was now a nursery in progress. Paint swatches were taped to the walls, soft greens, muted yellows, and baby furniture catalogs lay open on a nearby table. She walked in, stunned. Nathaniel entered behind her, his hands in his pockets. "I didn't want to assume," he said, "but I thought we could begin planning." She turned to him slowly. "You said you wanted no complications." "I did. And now? I'm discovering that the things worth having are rarely simple." They spent the next few days building the nursery together. It became a surprising source of joy. Eva insisted on small personal touches, knitted blankets, books from her childhood, and Nathaniel, while skeptical at first, came to understand their importance. He chose a glider chair and stayed up one night researching the safest crib models. They laughed more, argued about paint colors, and stood shoulder to shoulder while measuring walls. It was in many ways their first shared act of creation beyond the child itself. One evening, Stephanie brought news of a community outreach event for single mothers in a nearby town. Eva expressed interest, and to her surprise, Nathaniel offered to accompany her. They drove together, the town a modest patch of buildings surrounded by wildflowers and winding roads. At the event, Eva spoke with women who mirrored parts of her story, young, exhausted, fiercely protective of their children. She offered them words not of pity, but of understanding. And Nathaniel watched her, humbled. Later, as they returned home, Eva asked him quietly, "Do you regret any of this?" He was silent for a long moment before answering. "I regret that I didn't know sooner how hollow my life had become. But this, what we're building, it's the first thing I've done that feels alive." She didn't reply, but she reached over and took his hand, and he didn't pull away. The nights grew longer, and Eva began to feel the baby kick. The first time it happened, she was alone in her room, reading by the window. She gasped, pressed a hand to her belly, and whispered, "Hi there." The second time it happened, Nathaniel was with her, helping her unpack baby clothes. "Wait," she said, taking his hand and guiding it gently to her abdomen. There was a pause, then a tiny movement under his palm. Nathaniel froze. His eyes widened. And for a brief second, the stoic, calculated man she had come to know gave way to something tender, almost boyish. "That's him?" he asked, voice hushed. "Yes," Eva said, tears springing to her eyes. "That's your son." He didn't speak again for the rest of the night. But Eva saw the way he touched her belly now, not as a symbol of legacy or strategy, but as something precious, something miraculous. One night, Eva couldn't sleep. She wandered the halls, ending up in the music room where a dusty piano sat, unused. She touched the keys tentatively, pressing a single note. It echoed softly in the stillness. Behind her, a voice said, "Do you play?" She turned to find Nathaniel leaning in the doorway. "I used to," she said. "A little. I'd sneak into the church near our apartment when no one was there." He stepped inside. "Play something. I'm out of practice. Doesn't matter." So she did. The melody was simple, uncertain, but pure. She played a lullaby Catalina used to hum, and as the notes floated through the air, Nathaniel closed his eyes and let himself feel something he hadn't in years. When she finished, he said quietly, "If we'd met under different circumstances." Eva looked up at him, heart in her throat. "But we didn't." "No," he said. "We met exactly when we were supposed to." And though nothing more was spoken that night, a truth had settled between them, undeniable as the child growing inside her. They were no longer just two people bound by an agreement. They were becoming something neither contract nor logic could contain. They were becoming a family. The soft glow of late summer filtered through the French doors of the Hayes estate, casting long amber streaks across the polished floors. Eva had entered her third trimester, and the pregnancy was now undeniable in every movement, every breath. Her gait had slowed, her cravings had intensified, and sleep had become a stranger. Yet there was something ethereal in her presence, an inward glow that transcended fatigue and discomfort. She had begun to speak to the baby softly in the mornings, sometimes in Spanish, humming old lullabies that once floated through the apartment she shared with Catalina. Nathaniel noticed everything. He didn't say much, but his gestures spoke, louder than words. He adjusted her seating in every room, ordered meals specifically tailored to her changing dietary needs, and installed safety handles in the shower before she even had to ask. He began reading at night, not company reports or investment forecasts, but books about labor, early childhood development, and emotional bonding. His world had been one of precision and control, but now it expanded quietly and with reverence, to include the unpredictable poetry of fatherhood. They spent more time together than ever before. Evenings were often shared on the back porch where Eva reclined, feet up sipping herbal tea while Nathaniel read aloud from whichever book they'd agreed on. Some nights they talked for hours about the future, sometimes even daring to imagine it beyond the contract. But there was an unspoken hesitation in both of them to name what was growing between them. Love, if it was love, felt fragile, like porcelain still in the fire. Then came the call. Eva was in the middle of folding a set of tiny onesies in the nursery when her phone rang. The number on the screen made her stomach drop. It was the hospital. She answered, and as the nurse spoke, the world narrowed around her. Catalina had suffered a collapse. Her breathing had become dangerously shallow, and the doctors suspected it was pneumonia compounded by her chronic respiratory condition. They were doing everything they could, but they advised Eva to come immediately. Eva didn't think. She moved with urgency, grabbing her purse, barely registering Stephanie calling after her. By the time she reached the front door, Nathaniel was already there, car keys in hand. "I'll drive," he said simply. The road back into San Francisco felt longer than usual. Eva sat stiffly, her hands clenched over her belly, heart racing with dread. Nathaniel drove in silence, his face unreadable, but his free hand occasionally reached for hers, grounding her in the midst of the storm. When they arrived at UCSF Medical Center, Eva rushed through the halls she had come to know all too well. Catalina lay pale and still in a hospital bed, her chest rising and falling with labored rhythm. Tubes trailed from her arms, oxygen hissed softly from the mask covering her mouth. "Abuela," Eva whispered, her voice catching. Catalina stirred, her eyes fluttering open. When she saw Eva, a faint smile curved her lips. "My brave girl," she rasped. "You came." Eva sat by her side, holding her hand gently. "I'm here always," she said, fighting tears, "and you're going to be okay." Behind her, Nathaniel stood quietly, a respectful distance away, until a nurse entered to explain the costs and the decisions ahead. Before Eva could say a word, Nathaniel stepped forward. "Give her everything she needs. Private care, round-the-clock monitoring. Don't hold back. I'll cover it." Eva turned to him, stunned. Her throat tightened. "You don't have to." "I do," he said, meeting her eyes. "Because you shouldn't have to do this alone." For the next few days, Eva split her time between the hospital and the estate. Nathaniel arranged a driver for her and cleared his own schedule to accommodate hospital visits. He came with her every time, never complaining, always nearby when she needed support and invisible when she didn't. He brought fresh meals, remembered Catalina's favorite tea, and even convinced the nurses to bring in a reclining chair so Eva could rest comfortably. One afternoon, as they left the hospital, Eva asked quietly, "Why are you doing all of this?" Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. They reached the car, and only after helping her in did he reply. "Because this family matters to me," he said, "even if I didn't plan for it." His words lingered like a melody, unfinished and full of longing. When Catalina finally stabilized, she was discharged into the care of a private home nurse Nathaniel had personally vetted. Eva brought her back to a small rental home just outside the city, arranged by Stephanie, complete with medical equipment and 24-hour care. Catalina held Eva's face in her hands as they said goodbye that night. "You've grown into something stronger than I ever imagined," she said. "This child you carry, it will never doubt how loved they are." Eva kissed her grandmother's forehead, her heart swelling with a complicated mix of gratitude and grief. Back at the estate, the air felt heavier, as if all the emotion of the past days had settled into its walls. Nathaniel met her at the door, and for the first time he didn't speak. He just opened his arms. She walked into them without hesitation. It was the first time they had embraced, not for show, not for comfort, but simply because the space between them had grown too small to contain what they felt. That night, as the rain pattered against the windows, Eva lay in bed unable to sleep. The baby moved often now, small flutters that had become full kicks. She rested her hand on her belly, whispering to the child she was starting to see not just as part of a deal, but as her own. Nathaniel knocked softly before entering. "I can't sleep either," he admitted, settling into the armchair beside her bed. He looked tired, less polished than usual, sleeves rolled, collar loosened. "Do you think you're ready?" she asked him, her voice quiet in the dark. "For what?" "To be a father." He was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. Then, "I've prepared for everything. Schools, finances, estate plans. I know how to give him the best future money can buy. But being a father," he paused, "that's not about money, is it?" "No," she said. "It's about showing up, even when it's hard. Especially then." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "I'm afraid," he confessed. "Not of the responsibility, but of repeating the coldness I was raised in. I've spent my whole life avoiding becoming my father, but I don't know who I am without that armor." Eva reached for his hand. "You're not him, Nathaniel. You never were." The silence between them stretched, but it no longer felt lonely. It felt like trust. Weeks later, under a crimson sunrise, Eva woke to a sharp pain that rippled through her abdomen. At first, she dismissed it as another Braxton Hicks contraction, but when the second came, stronger and closer, she knew. "It's time," she whispered. Stephanie was already up when Nathaniel called out. Within minutes, they were en route to the hospital. The labor was long. Eva endured it with a strength Nathaniel had never witnessed. He stayed beside her the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her brow, whispering encouragement. His control faltered more than once, especially when she cried out, when she trembled, when her breathing turned ragged. But he never left. Hours later, the room was filled with the high, urgent cry of a newborn. The nurse held up the baby boy and Eva wept. As they laid him on her chest, Nathaniel stood frozen. He stared at his son, and something inside him cracked open. He approached slowly, almost reverently, his eyes wet but unblinking. "He's perfect," he murmured. Eva looked up at him, exhausted but glowing. "Would you like to hold him?" Nathaniel hesitated. Then he took the baby into his arms, cradling him with the delicacy of someone holding the entire world. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, it was to Eva. "I want you to stay," he said, voice low but firm. "Not because of the contract. Because I can't imagine raising him without you. Because I don't want this life, him, you, to be something I lose." Tears streamed down Eva's cheeks. "I don't want to leave," she whispered. Their hands met over the blanket that covered their child, and in that moment everything changed. The contract that brought them together had faded into irrelevance. In its place stood something real, something irrevocable. The first days at home with the baby were a blur of sleepless nights, soft lullabies, and quiet moments that hovered like candlelight, fragile, warm, and impossibly intimate. The estate, once a place of quiet calculation and sterile routine, had transformed into a sanctuary pulsing with new life. The newborn's cries echoed down marble halls that had once known only silence. The scent of lavender from Eva's bath mixed with the faint milky sweetness of the baby. The nursery, once a symbol of planning, had become a place of waking dreams. They named him Leo. The name had come to Eva in a moment of stillness when she held him close for the first time and saw the strength in his tiny squinting face. When she spoke it aloud, Nathaniel simply nodded as though he'd already known. Leo Hayes. The name felt solid and bright, like the beginning of something neither of them had words for yet. Nathaniel surprised everyone, including himself, by being present for every part of those first chaotic weeks. He changed diapers, burped Leo over his shoulder, and walked the nursery floor at 3 a.m., whispering nonsense just to calm the baby's cries. He had never looked more out of place, and yet somehow he had never looked more at home. Eva watched him closely, not as the man who once offered her a contract, but as someone reborn through uncertainty and love. He moved differently now. There was less rigidity, more instinct. His touch, once clinical and cautious, had softened with trust. He held Leo with care but without fear, learning to read his son's needs with the quiet urgency of someone desperate to get it right. Their relationship shifted again, not with dramatic confessions, but through a steady unfolding of shared purpose. They ate meals together not out of obligation but comfort. Nathaniel now lingered in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, helping to prepare food or pouring tea for Eva while she nursed. The mansion's vastness no longer seemed cold. It felt like a home. One evening, as Eva rocked Leo to sleep, Nathaniel stood in the doorway watching her. The soft golden light caught in her hair, and for a moment all the rules he had once clung to seemed trivial. He walked to her slowly, bent down, and kissed her forehead. "You make this place breathe," he whispered. Eva looked up at him, tears in her eyes. "You make it feel safe." He took her free hand in his and held it to his chest. "I want more than this arrangement," he said. "I want to build a life with you. Not just for Leo, for us." Her heart beat wildly. It wasn't a grand proposal. It was something more sacred. An offering of a future shaped by their shared strength. The following weeks passed in a rhythm uniquely their own. They took turns with feedings, with late-night singing, with morning walks through the vineyard where Leo would gaze up from his stroller, wide-eyed at the world. Nathaniel began easing out of the daily operations of Hayes Technologies. He attended only critical meetings and left his second-in-command in charge of strategy. He no longer saw his work as the cornerstone of his identity, but rather as a tool to support the life he was now building. One day, while Eva was napping with Leo on her chest, Nathaniel placed a small velvet box beside her on the nightstand. Inside was a ring, elegant, simple, and radiant with sincerity. When she awoke and found it, she didn't cry. She simply walked into the study where he was sitting and stood before him, barefoot and sleepy. "Yes," she said, holding the box. "Yes to all of it." The wedding was quiet and private, held in the estate's garden at golden hour. Rows of white chairs, a path lined with soft petals, and a handful of people who had come to matter. Stephanie stood with pride as Eva walked down the aisle, Leo in her arms, and Nathaniel waiting with eyes that held no armor. Their vows weren't perfect, but they were real. Nathaniel promised to be more than a protector. He promised to be present, to lead not with control, but with care. Eva promised to continue challenging him, loving him, and reminding him of the life they had created together. One choice, one heartbeat, one brave step at a time. After the ceremony, they danced under a canopy of stars. Leo slept peacefully in a bassinet nearby, and the night air smelled of jasmine and warm soil. As the weeks turned into months, life settled into a harmony that surprised them both. They took weekend trips to the coast, Leo nestled in a carrier against Nathaniel's chest. Eva started writing again, recording moments in a leather-bound journal now full of first smiles, first giggles, and first dreams of what their life would continue to become. Nathaniel, once incapable of rest, now found peace in early morning feeds and quiet walks at dusk. He began working on a new project, a philanthropic initiative focused on providing resources for single mothers inspired by Eva's journey. She helped design it, bringing in voices from the community, making sure it was more than charity. It was dignity offered in practical form. They began speaking more openly about the future, about more children, about the kind of parents they wanted to be, not just for Leo but for whatever came next. And then one crisp morning in October, Ava took Nathaniel's hand in hers and placed it on her belly. His eyes widened. Are you? She nodded, smiling. Yes. Tears filled his eyes. This time he didn't hold them back. They sat in silence, foreheads pressed together, the new heartbeat between them already changing everything again. Nathaniel had spent his life building empires. Ava had spent hers surviving. Together, they were learning what it meant to create something that didn't need defending, only nurturing. They were building a family, not just by blood but by choice, and that made all the difference. As the second pregnancy progressed, Ava found herself both more confident and more vulnerable than she had ever expected. The journey this time felt different. With Leo, there had been so much uncertainty, so much fear and distance. Now she was surrounded by care, by a man who held her hair back during morning sickness, who placed a gentle hand on her back when she climbed stairs, who didn't flinch when she wept from hormones or exhaustion or simply the overwhelming realization of how far she'd come. Nathaniel wasn't perfect. He still had moments of emotional detachment, days where the world seemed to pull him back into the cold, calculated habits of his past. But he always came back to her. He made a conscious effort. He apologized more now, and not just in the language of actions. He admitted when he was wrong. And Eva, who had spent most of her life apologizing simply for existing, began to believe she no longer needed to. Together they began redecorating a second nursery. Leo, now toddling with surprising confidence through the halls of the estate, seemed fascinated by the idea of becoming a big brother. He would pat Ava's belly with his chubby hands and whisper to it like it held secrets only he could understand. Ava often caught Nathaniel watching those moments from the doorway, his expression soft with wonder, awe, and a quiet fear of losing something so unexpectedly precious. They began creating rituals. Friday mornings were now for family breakfast in the courtyard, Leo smeared with jam, Ava glowing in a linen robe, and Nathaniel pretending to read the paper but really just watching them. Sunday nights were movie nights. Ava curled into Nathaniel's chest while Leo fell asleep halfway through the film. They weren't just living in the estate now. They were inhabiting it, filling its once empty rooms with music, messes, and memory. Eva found herself journaling more. Her entries shifted from recording her survival to recording her joy. She began writing essays about resilience, motherhood, and what it meant to choose love not out of desperation, but out of healing. With Nathaniel's quiet encouragement, she submitted one of them to a parenting magazine. It was published a month later, and the letters that followed brought tears to her eyes. Other women, strangers, who saw themselves in her story. Maybe your story will be the start of someone else's, Nathaniel told her, holding the printed article like it was gold. Eva nodded. Maybe that's how we make meaning, by surviving long enough to help someone else survive. Nathaniel's Foundation for Single Mothers officially launched that spring. Eva was the face of it. She spoke at the opening ceremony, her belly round, Leo on her hip, and Nathaniel at her side. Her voice shook at first, but steadied as she spoke about dignity, about how hard it is to ask for help, and about the unexpected beauty that came from being seen. Afterward, Nathaniel took her, hand in front of the crowd, and kissed her palm. He didn't need to make a speech. She had said everything that mattered. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the vineyard, Ava sat beneath a sycamore tree while Nathaniel rocked Leo nearby. She felt the baby kick again and again, like a drum of life echoing through her body. "Those, you think we would have ever found each other?" she asked softly. "If things had been different?" Nathaniel looked over at her, eyes deep and steady. "I think we were always meant to find each other," he said. "But maybe we had to be broken in the right ways to fit together." Ava smiled, blinking back tears. "Do you regret how it started?" she asked, not because she feared the answer, but because she wanted to understand the man she loved even more fully. Nathaniel walked over, knelt beside her, and placed his palm over the place where their second child moved. "No," he said, "because without that beginning, I wouldn't have this ending." They kissed beneath the tree, the vineyard stretching behind them, Leo giggling somewhere in the grass. It wasn't the ending, of course. It was simply the beginning of something fuller, messier, more human than either of them had imagined when they first signed a contract and pretended it was only about business. The past still lingered sometimes. Ava would wake in the night, breathless, from dreams of her mother's hospital room or the echo of hunger in her childhood bones. Nathaniel sometimes went still for long stretches, especially when memories of his father resurfaced. But now they faced those shadows together. They began talking about names for the new baby. Ava liked nature names, something simple but strong. Nathaniel surprised her by suggesting Mila, the name of a fictional character his mother used, to read to him about, a girl who found beauty in unlikely places. Ava said yes immediately. The name felt like light breaking through. As her due date approached, the anxiety returned, mingling with anticipation. But this time, they were ready. Nathaniel took time off work entirely. Stephanie moved into the guest house to help with Leo. The medical team was on call, and the nursery was filled with everything they needed and more. Then one evening, as thunder rolled softly in the distance, Ava felt the first wave of pain. It came low and sharp, and then again, quicker than she remembered from Leo. She called for Nathaniel, who appeared instantly, already steady, already bracing for the hours ahead. But the hours were fewer than expected. Mila arrived fast, determined and healthy. When Nathaniel held her for the first time, tears spilled down his face before he could stop them. "She's everything," he whispered. Eva, exhausted and radiant, nodded. "She's us." They returned home 2 days later to find Leo waiting with wide eyes and outstretched arms. He looked at his sister with cautious curiosity, then leaned down and kissed her forehead without being told. The estate bloomed again. With Mila's arrival, their family became not just whole, but complete. The once lonely man with skyscrapers in his name, and the once weary woman with nothing but survival stitched into her spine, had built a life neither of them thought possible. Not perfect, not always easy, but real. And in the quiet hours of night, when both children slept and the house sighed with peace, Nathaniel would lie beside Ava and whisper the words he once feared most. "I love you." And every time Eva whispered back, "I know." The days following Mila's birth unfolded in a serene rhythm, each moment steeped in the quiet joy of newfound completeness. The estate, once a symbol of solitude and calculated ambition, now resonated with the gentle hum of family life. The sunlit corridors echoed with Leo's delighted laughter and Mila's soft coos, weaving a tapestry of sounds that spoke of love, growth, and the promise of tomorrow. Eva found herself enveloped in a profound sense of fulfillment. Her journey from a life marked by uncertainty to one rich with purpose was nothing short of transformative. She embraced her roles with grace, mother, partner, and now an advocate for women navigating paths similar to her own. Her writings, once private reflections, began to reach a wider audience, offering solace and strength to those who saw their own struggles mirrored in her words. Nathaniel too underwent a metamorphosis. The man who once measured success in profits and acquisitions now found his greatest achievements in bedtime stories, shared meals, and the quiet moments of connection with his family. He continued to support Eva's endeavors, standing beside her as she championed causes close to her heart, their partnership a testament to mutual respect and shared dreams. Together, they cultivated a life that balanced the demands of their past with the aspirations of their future. The estate became a haven not just for their family but for the community they nurtured, hosting gatherings, supporting local initiatives, and opening their doors to those in need. Their love, once a quiet undercurrent, now stood as a beacon, illuminating the path they had forged together. As seasons changed, so did the chapters of their lives. Leo and Mila grew, their personalities blossoming under the watchful eyes of their parents. Ava and Nathaniel faced challenges, as all families do, but their bond, tempered by trials and strengthened by shared values, held firm. They learned that love was not just a feeling but a series of choices made daily. Choices to listen, to support, to forgive, and to grow. In the quiet moments, as they watched their children play under the vast sky, Ava and Nathaniel often reflected on their journey. From a contract born of necessity to a life built on love and trust, their story was a testament to the unexpected paths that lead to the most profound destinations. Their legacy was not just in the wealth they had accumulated, but in the lives they touched, the love they shared, and the family they built. A legacy that would endure, echoing through the halls of the estate and the hearts of those who knew their story. It was a chilly spring morning when the unexpected letter arrived. At the Hayes estate, Ava found it folded neatly among a stack of forwarded mail, the envelope unmarked except for a New York City return address. At first she assumed it was another request related to her writing or the foundation, until she opened it and the words inside pulled the air from her lungs. To Nathaniel Hayes and Ava Morales, "You don't know me, but I know who you are. And I believe the child you're raising as yours might also be mine. I need to speak with you, urgently. The letter was signed by a woman named Lauren Sinclair, a name that meant nothing to Eva, until Nathaniel walked in and saw the page. Trembling in her hand, he paled. I know her, he said, his voice barely audible. We dated years ago. Briefly. Eva stared at him. She's claiming Leo could be hers? No, he said, shaking his head. That's impossible. We ended things long before Leo was even conceived. But she's not the type to bluff, without motive. The weeks that followed unraveled everything they thought was secure. Lauren arrived in San Francisco, not with aggression, but with sorrow and a sealed court document. She claimed to have had a child, born prematurely, and given up for adoption under immense personal pressure. But a recent investigation, sparked by regret and lingering doubts, led her to suspect her child had been illegally adopted into a surrogacy program linked to one of Nathaniel's previous investments. DNA tests were requested. Eva, shaken but resolute, agreed. She watched Nathaniel crumble in private, guilt etched into his face not for any wrongdoing, but for the shadows of his past returning to threaten the light they had built. Days later, the results confirmed what they feared. A genetic match. Lauren was Leo's biological mother. But the truth didn't end their story. It deepened it. Lauren, overwhelmed by the connection but emotionally unprepared to parent, made a decision that redefined all their lives. She relinquished her parental rights, officially naming Nathaniel and Eva as Leo's legal guardians, on one condition. She could write to him when he was older and explain her choice. Eva embraced Lauren before she left, their eyes full of tears. Two women shaped by different battles, connected now by a child neither would ever stop loving. That moment became a turning point. Not a fracture, but a fusion. Nathaniel and Eva realized that family wasn't just chosen. Sometimes it was forged in fire, in forgiveness, and in the quiet courage of doing what was right, even when it hurt. If you followed this story to this point, thank you for being a part of it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next emotional, unforgettable chapter in our journey. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories like this to life.